Here we are in week 8 of the module on project stakeholders and leadership. This is week 8. Obviously there was no week 7, so actually it's the 7th, no week 6. So actually it's the 7th video for you. Week 6 was the research week where some of you did your independent research. Okay, so let's think about project stakeholders and leadership. Really, this session can be broken down into two very distinct sections. So the first part, I'll tackle project stakeholders, stakeholder management, some issues around stakeholder theory, and think about that in relation to project management. And in the second section, I'll look at leadership, what I mean by project leadership, project management, managers, whether they're the same thing, different things, and try to think about that. And again, I'll be looking at a bit of leadership theory. I'm only going to touch on leadership theory, and if you've done anything on organisational leadership anywhere else in your course, then that'll be a go-to area which might help you with this section. Okay, so two different sections. Here we go. Start with stakeholders. Now I've got a little cartoon here, really, but it's kind of well-known. Versions of this are found everywhere, right across the internet. It was known well before the internet. When I started out in my working career, I had come across this cartoon. So, but it's quite neat, and it's in a rather, I guess, entertaining way. It shows the issues with stakeholders, how different people with different perspectives on the same thing see it totally differently. And this is the reality of stakeholders, and their involvement in projects becomes a major issue. So I think this is an IT project, how the customer explained it in a certain way. They want to obviously swing from a tree. How the project leader understood it, something somewhat different. You can see it's not particularly a good understanding of what the customer explained. How the analyst designed it, totally over-engineered and ridiculous. How the programmer wrote it, would never serve the purpose. How the business consultant described it, something amazing. We've got how the project was documented. Strange enough, there's almost no documentation in projects. What operations were installed? Very little. How the customers billed for something astonishing. How it was supported, virtually no support, and what the customer really needed. So different people, different stakeholders in the project understanding the same thing in very different ways. And this is a reflection of what we get in projects, with different stakeholders being involved in projects. So we'll start with a little bit of theory. Well, the first thing to say is that very little project management literature covers stakeholder theory, or stakeholder management really. It's covered in the textbook which we're using for this module, briefly in chapter 10, and you'll find bits and pieces in some of the mainstream project management guidance. So things like the Project Management Institute, the Association of Project Management, Prince2, they all have sections on stakeholder management, but none of them really tackle that from a theoretical perspective. And of course, to understand something broadly and with any depth, you need to think about the theory as a starting point. Okay, so what is stakeholder theory? It's about people, really. Groups of people who, from a project management point of view, who are either involved in or affected by the performance or completion of project activities. So almost everybody who might in some way come in contact with a project will be a stakeholder. And this includes internal stakeholders, the project team, people involved in the project from a delivery point of view, and external stakeholders, people affected by the project or who just have an interest in the project. Stakeholders can exert influence over the project delivery and or team members. So the reason we're concerned about stakeholders really is that they can have an impact on projects. Often from a project management, orthodox project management perspective, stakeholders are seen as a risk. often stakeholders have very different needs and expectations of the project. So they'll look at it some stakeholders might see it as a drain on resources and diversion of resources away from normal operations. Other people involved in looking at the project might see it as an opportunity. Other people might say it's a crazy idea, and so forth. So lots of people will see the project in very different ways. So the purpose of the business is to create as much value as possible for stakeholders. I put some in brackets there. Some stakeholders will receive a lot of value, normally customers and consumers. Other stakeholders might receive no value. These might be people who are maybe antagonistic to the organisational goals and therefore the project goals. Aligning stakeholder interests or trading them off. This is the real concern for stakeholder management. Okay, so a little bit more about stakeholders. Who are stakeholders? So as I've already said, they can be internal or external. So people involved in the project or people outside the project who have an interest in it. They can be end users. So the people who receive the outputs and outcomes of the project. Other interested parties, people who just have an interest or a concern about what the project involves. People otherwise affected by the project, maybe passers-by if it's a building or something like that, or people who may somehow either suffer or benefit from the project, and they can be legitimate or non-legitimate. So legitimate stakeholders, I'll come on to that in a moment when I talk about some of the more the theory around stakeholders. So legitimate stakeholders are people who are formally connected to the project. Non-legitimate stakeholders are people or groups of people who aren't necessarily formally connected to the project but have an interest in it. Now, in fact, all these overlap, all these categories overlap. And as I said earlier, almost anyone may be a stakeholder, may have an interest in the project. If they've got an interest in the project, then they're a stakeholder. Then from the project management point of view, it's a matter of categorising those people or groups of people and then thinking about how they can be managed. A lot of the theory I'm using is from an ex-colleague of mine down at Bristol University, Andy Friedman, and his colleague Miles, who wrote this paper, Developing Stakeholder Theory, in the Journal of Management Studies in 2002. They worked on a lot of the things which we now see as, I think Andy Friedman came up with a book as well on the basis of that paper. And they've developed a lot of the ways of thinking about stakeholder management which have become fairly mainstream now. In terms of how we involve stakeholders, well, from the project point of view, where do we involve them? Is it in the outline project definition? In other words, what we're trying to deliver in the project? We will involve stakeholders, obviously, but which ones? Maybe developing the scope, what's included, what's not included in the project. Again, stakeholders will be involved. Again, it's a matter of which ones. And then in terms of project implementation, delivery of the project. Again, stakeholders are involved. Which ones will be involved at that stage? Which ones won't be involved? Those are the questions which the project manager and project team need to ask. Also, stakeholders can have a disruptive influence in projects. Even stakeholders who are very positively aligned and committed to the project, and maybe and certainly legitimate stakeholders, even they can have a disruptive influence on the project. Okay, so Friedman and Miles came up with this fairly neat model. This is one of several models which I'll employ here. So this is the starting point. So what we have are two axes, and this is really around the legitimacy of stakeholders, whether they are in some way formally connected to the project. Friedman and Miles weren't necessarily looking at projects, but the case they used can be understood as a project, and I'll come on to that in a moment. So we have here two axes. One is the alignment of interests. Are the stakeholders' interests and the interests of the project team compatible or incompatible? and then their role in achieving the outcome of the project. Are they necessary to achieving the outcome or unnecessary? And we can go through each of these boxes, and you'll see, so you've got 2x2 box here, and you can see how Freeman and Miles have articulated this in terms of contract theory. So here we have where stakeholders are compatible with the interests of the organisation and necessary to their goals and aims. Then key direct stakeholders have a contractual relationship. Contracts are recognised as valid by all parties involved. Where they're compatible but not necessarily with necessary to achieving the outcome, relations here are where there's no formal contract, no direct relationship between the parties. Compatible interests may be furthered by forming formal contracts. Then next we have stakeholders who are incompatible to the goals of the organisation, but nevertheless necessary to their achieving the outcome. Here, organisations and groups and people are encouraged to answer the claims. Organisations are encouraged to answer the claims and criticisms of stakeholders, in spite of incompatible interests. And finally, organisation or stakeholder relations do not involve any contractual relationship, implicit or explicit, recognised or unrecognised. Now, I feel the main contribution for Freeman and Miles is they took this kind of fairly well understood model and understood it's a dynamic model, and they used a case to illustrate this. So back in the 1990s, there was a big oil platform. It was a storage base and for oil in the North Sea, the top around Shetland Islands, and called Brent Spar, and it was run by Shell, and it had reached the end of its useful life, and Shell wanted to dispose of it by sinking it in the Atlantic Ocean. And Greenpeace responded to this by saying, well, hold on, this will create or potentially create massive environmental damage. We oppose this, and they created a worldwide campaign to discourage the disposal of the Brent Spar oil facility in the Atlantic. This was partly through a lot of media and a lot of argument and a lot of debate and politics and lobbying, going on to news channels, getting articles printed in the press, as well as you can see here, direct action, sailing their dinghies right up to boats and to the ship, and getting a lot of press attention this way as well, floating their dinghies, running their dinghies in front of the disposal cruise ships and stuff like that. So they were doing what Greenpeace were famous for doing, which was both a mixture of direct action and lobbying and broader campaigning. So what Freeman and Miles did was track the role of Greenpeace on their model and its relationship with Shell, in particular, using the Brent Spar case, but also more generally in the general discourse of environmental activism and environmental concern and politics. So they started in 1971, where Greenpeace was seen as a bit of a peripheral group, were regarded as being unnecessary to the outcomes of most organisations and incompatible in their aims. And over time, they shifted. So by the mid-1980s, they were still unnecessary, but becoming more necessary because of their actions, because of their activities. They were still incompatible with the aims of most organisations. They were saying that what organisations were doing was damaging the environment, damaging wildlife, and their concern was that production and industrial activities were problematic and needed to be addressed and considered more carefully. As they became more active and particularly more disruptive, so they were marginalised. So that by the late 1980s, early 1990s, they were being pushed away from organisations, pushed out of the way and made less necessary. They were being arrested. Activists were being arrested, and their activities quelled by the political establishment. However, when Brent Spar started to happen, they gained a lot more legitimacy. They were seen as having a role. They were seen as making life for Shell in particular and for other organisations really difficult. And so essentially they made themselves necessary to the goals and aims of organisations. The Brent Spar case, well, what was Brent Spar? It was the disposal of a huge oil facility in the North Sea, in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, that effectively is a project which Shell were trying to undertake. Had all the characteristics of projects, a unique undertaking. It was time delimited. It had resources which were being expended on that activity, and Shell were trying to get this to happen. And the role of Greenpeace, both legitimately and illegitimately, was impacting on their ability to deliver this project. Huge amounts of pressure from politicians around the world, huge amounts of damage to the Shell brand, huge amounts of cost to Shell. So what Shell were doing was trying to undertake this project and were being stymied all the way by Greenpeace. And so effectively Greenpeace shifted themselves from this kind of marginalised group into a group which was centre ground and a central critic of what Shell and other organisations were trying to achieve. And in doing so, their cooperation was necessary. They were still incompatible with the goals of these major organisations, but they were necessary for those organisations to achieve their goals. So they made themselves legitimate, and even their illegitimate activities were clothed in legitimacy, and they made themselves, in particular, necessary. And so we can see that that's the present day. That's where they are now. And here's a picture of, this is Ban Ki-moon of the UN, and representatives from major organisations and Shell in a room with a picture being taken. They've become part of the international discourse, the global discourse around environmentalism, activism, and the relationship between major organisations and corporations and the environment. So they've created themselves a role through their activities. Okay, so let's think about this from more of a managerial perspective. The project management team must identify both internal and external stakeholders in order to determine the project requirements and expectations of all parties involved. This is important. So a bit like when I talked about risk, which is about identifying different risks, here project team have to do something else, which is to identify different stakeholders. Who are the internal stakeholders? They may not always be obvious. If you're carrying out some sort of change project within your organisation, there may be a multiplicity of stakeholders who may not even be obvious at the outset of the project. Who are the external stakeholders? Who knows? Well, we need to try and identify who might externally have an interest in the project. I've got a couple of examples later which hopefully will enable you to think this through a bit more carefully. And each will have expectations, so it's not just identifying them, but trying to understand their requirements, what they want from the project, if anything, and what their expectations are. Furthermore, the project manager and project team maybe must manage the influence of the various stakeholders in relation to the project requirements. As I said earlier, even project stakeholders who are highly compatible, highly supportive of the project can have a detrimental influence to achieving the project goals. So that influence has to be managed throughout the project, at the planning stage, at the outset, right through to project delivery. There are a lot of difficulties with this, huge difficulties. It's easy enough for me to say it here, but in particular, in some ways, identifying stakeholders is the easy part, managing the influence is the really difficult part. Okay, so what are some of the issues involved? The first one to think about is stakeholder salience in terms of power. So What is the power of different stakeholders? How much influence can they have on the project? How much power do they have over the project team, or over the project resources, or over some other aspect of the project which might be crucial to its delivery? What is their legitimacy? Are they contractually involved, contractually connected, or do they have some other formal connection with the project, or are they marginalised or peripheral to the project? And then, what's their urgency? In other words, how important is the project to their needs? How concerned are they with the activities occurring within the project? What about subversive stakeholders? Like Greenpeace, they're a subversive stakeholder. I think in the when I was teaching this in the session, I talked about my experience when I was quite young, living in Winchester, and the impact of a coalition of unlikely stakeholders who impacted on the extension of the M3 motorway past Winchester, connecting London to Southampton. And there was a group of environmental activists and the Winchester residents who were, or some of the great and good of Winchester, who were both working together to prevent or limit the ability of the contractors to deliver the motorway. It's about building coalitions and resources. From a management point of view, the project team need to build coalitions with different stakeholder groups and control those through representatives, and have resources to manage their involvement. It's about managing conflict escalation, trying to limit conflict, trying to keep conflict away from the project activities and project delivery. Okay, so the stakeholder management process, what do we do? So there's three parts really: identification, analysis, and then the management. So identification of stakeholders involves considering who is involved in, affected by, or can affect the project. Typically, just like in risk management, this is carried out through some sort of brainstorming activity of potential stakeholders, where you consider the resources needed for the project and who might control those resources or have an influence on those resources. Organisations or people who will be affected by the project. These could be external organisations, people who just might have a passing interest in the project. Then we have organisations or people on the sidelines of the project who will influence attitudes and behaviours. Also, for lots of projects, there's statutory or regulatory bodies or other organisations who have an oversight on project activities. Okay, so here's a model which I think comes from the Association of Project Management, which is a kind of way of thinking about structuring the identification of stakeholders. So here we have at the bottom you can see in this model we have internal and external stakeholders, and with the internal stakeholders who are internal to the project and involved closely in the project. We have the demand side, people who have a involvement in acquiring the project, and the supply side, the organisations involved in delivering the project. And you can see that in the demand side we've got sponsors, steering groups, shareholders, financiers, employees, customers and consumers. The supply side we have contractors, subcontractors, consultants, technology suppliers, and so on and so forth. Okay, and in the external category we have private and public organisations. And the private side we have, you can see a variety of different organisations who might be involved, including non-governmental organisations. And in the public side we have regulatory agencies, local government and national government, and so forth. So these are broad categories, and within these you can a project manager or project team could identify specific stakeholders who they might be interested in, and maybe even representatives of those stakeholders who they can create dialogue with. Once the stakeholders have been identified, they need to be analysed. So this is about trying to understand their position in relationship to the project. So questions you might ask include, do they have an interest in the project succeeding? That's not sorry, that's not the same as whether they want the project to succeed, but do they have an interest in it succeeding? Do they have an interest in the project failing, maybe? And often that is the case. And these may not be overt interests. They may be hidden interests, but nevertheless they may have an interest in the project failing. Will they be openly supportive of the project as it progresses? It's a good question. And remember, think about Friedman and Miles's analysis. Project involvement or stakeholder involvement in projects varies over time. Is the stakeholder or stakeholder group ambivalent about the project? They don't really care one way or another. Could the stakeholder have negative views about what the project will deliver? What are their expectations, and can these be managed? And how will they use their influence to support the project or hinder the project? And then we can use this quite useful stakeholder mapping model to think about where the stakeholders are. It's called a power interest matrix, used a lot in projects, and it's about, on the one dimension you have the power to influence the project, which may be low or high, and on the bottom axis there you can see level of interest in the project, which may be low or high. Those ones up where they've got a high level of power to influence the project plus a high interest in the project will be key players, and you need to involve those, and you can see that other categories of stakeholders require different kinds of engagement. This also comes from the Association of Project Management, stakeholder grid, and it's a way of thinking about identifying stakeholders who are against the project and stakeholders who are for the project and their relative interest and power. So effectively, the model is repeated twice, one for supportive stakeholders and the other for unsupportive stakeholders. And this is the kind of thing you might end up producing. So this is an example of a kind of a project of some sort, purchasing change to a purchasing systems, so it's an organisational change project. And you can see that there's a number of stakeholders identified, sometimes specific individual, in this case specific individuals, but it could be groups as well. And across the top, the range of support is either strongly against, or strongly supportive, and current position and desired position are listed. And the idea, the project team's job really is to shift their positions over time. And some ideas about how to achieve that are listed on the right-hand side of the slide there. So for stakeholder management, general strategies for managing stakeholders, we need to think as a project team whether we're going to incorporate them, involve them in the project, marginalise them, push them away from the project, protect them, the project from them, or just ignore them and hope they go away, or maybe just keep them informed at a very superficial level. All these have implications, and you can think about maybe some of the implications of doing these different things with different stakeholders. Okay, so that's stakeholders talked about. Now I want to change tack totally and tackle the next section, which is the project manager. Are we talking about a manager or a leader? What do we mean by those terms? And what does this involve? What does identifying and being a project manager actually involve? So, the project manager, what do we mean by that? Is it an individual or a group? Sometimes we can have a group of people who are in control of a project, a very large project, a massive project over many years. I'll talk later in the module about PPP type projects. Those sort of projects will be run as businesses in and of themselves. Smaller projects might just have a single individual who's in charge. We talk about sometimes project directors, project managers, project controllers, other terms are used. From my point of view, this is the way I look at it. A project manager is both a leader in that they have to cope with change, they have to cope with the issues around change, the project is a change in and of itself, but is impacted by changes in terms of decisions and in terms of roles and responsibilities. And they have to be a manager as well, in that they have to cope with the complexity of the project, the complexity of activities which are integrated to deliver the project. In the lecture I talked about Apollo 13. You can see some of the videos which are linked to at the bottom there in the grayed out section. So Apollo 13 is a fantastic film. If you get a chance to watch it, just do so. I'd highly recommend it. It shows the role of the ground control and the leader of the ground control team in trying to deal with the problems they encountered in managing the disaster, the unfolding disaster of Apollo 13 trying to get back to Earth. Okay, so great film, a good example of project management in action. Project manager in action, should I say. So yeah, it's a great role for Ed Harris in that film where he really gives a fantastic rendition of a portrayal of a project manager in action. Okay, so some of the activities that project managers might be asked to undertake, as you can see, is adapted from Bowenkamp and Kleiner's paper, Industrial Management and Data Systems, How to be a Successful Project Manager. So, what do project managers do? They're involved or responsible for thoroughly planning the project and soliciting the involvement of different functional or organisational areas. They control the human resources needed by the project. So they're in charge of the resources that are coming to the project, the people, and how they're going to deliver their activities. They are involved in often basic technical definitions of the project, and crucially, although project managers often aren't experts, technical experts themselves, or maybe only have a partial technical expertise, they're not employed actually for the technical brilliance. They're employed for their ability to understand the technical issues and relate that to particularly cost trade-offs and organisational trade-offs. They need to exercise strong positive leadership, talk about what that might mean, and they monitor performance. How's the project doing against the plan? And also they're responsible for completing the project quality expectations. What are the expectations of the project and how are we going to achieve that? They've got to deliver it on schedule and within cost. So there's the iron triangle, which, as I've said in the past, is essentially the mantra of the project manager. This iron triangle becomes increasingly their mantra as the project progresses. So the project manager's essential performance criteria. Some of the roles they have. So they're an integrator. They integrate people, they integrate resources to deliver the project. They're a facilitator, facilitating relationships within the project between stakeholders of the project. They're a communicator, again communicating to various stakeholders, to customers, to suppliers. They might be a virtual project manager in that they're coordinating different organisations and different people across over social media or over some sort of medium, which is an intervention between them and the organisation or person they're trying to deal with, and maybe geographically dispersed. They can be a convener or chairperson. They often are, and one of the regular things that project managers do is convene meetings and then chair those meetings. Where risks occur, they're often firefighters and dealing with troubleshooting the problems. Refer to Apollo 13 for examples of that. They're also about leadership, leading, providing direction, as well as compromising, dealing with competing needs, competing wants of the project. Other things they can do, they negotiate, they deal with conflict and resolve conflict, and they persuade people to maybe provide resources they need or to do things they want. They also provide contact between the end user and other stakeholders often. and the project. Other things it might do, they provide a sense of direction. I think this is a major point of leadership. They provide a point of accountability, another leadership issue, that if something goes wrong, they take responsibility. They might be an evangelist, having to promote the project and promote its outcomes and its outputs. An entrepreneur, in the sense that they have to find new ways of doing things and almost operate the project as a mini business. They certainly are, I think, change agents, but given that all projects are an activity of change within organisations or within society at large. So, how do we select the project manager? Well, they need to have credibility in the first instance. They need to be credible and be seen as credible. They need to have sensitivity to different stakeholder needs, to different expectations. They need to have good leadership, a style of leadership which is appropriate to the needs of the project, and a strong set of ethics. I suspect often project managers end up getting chosen by default. We need somebody to manage a project. Who you've got, that person there will be the project manager. And certainly some of the research I've done in the past, I did some work with the Ministry of Defence and for the Royal Air Force, I found that project management and project leadership was seen as not a demotion as such, but as a chore which officers had to get through in order to get to progress their career, and was seen as a sidelining on their career. They need to crucially deal with the authority gap between them as a project manager and the key leaders or representatives of the different functions and organisations who are providing resources to the project. So they have to influence people, they have to have expert power and referent power. I'll come on to those in a moment. So, what is leadership? Okay, so some common themes within leadership, definitions of leadership are: leadership is an influencing process. So you need to be able to influence people to get them to do what you want them to do. Leaders need followers. So somebody's in charge and you have people who follow that person and they set the direction, the goals which you're trying to achieve, and then the followers follow them in that direction. Inevitably, as a result of that, there's an unequal power distribution. Leadership occurs when trying to achieve certain objectives, so it's something that emerges, and it involves providing direction. Interestingly, there are no clear links between direction, leadership and motivation. There are clear links between direction, leadership and motivation. But leadership is not necessarily the same as formal authority. You can be a leader who just emerges from a group and not necessarily have formal representative authority. So, a key question. To exercise strong, positive leadership and influence, a project manager needs to have power. But where does this power, project manager's power, source of power, derive? So let's think about some of the sources of power for leaders. We have legitimate power. So a project manager is given a position, might be a title project manager or program manager or something like that, and they have a position within the organisation, and from that they have authority. They have reward power in some cases. So this is where they have capacity to control by providing rewards which are valued to others. Maybe increases in pay, maybe kudos, maybe something else. They have coercive power, which is the obverse of reward power, I guess, where you can punish people who don't engage in the behaviour you wish them to engage in. They have expert power sometimes, and often actually in projects, surprisingly, a project manager is chosen because they're an expert in a particular domain or an expert in a particular field, and they end up becoming a project manager. So it stems from possession of particular expertise that is valued by others. They might often actually have information power. This is about access to, and control over the distribution of important information. And referent power. This is where people are just admired. They are liked. They have charisma. Ultimately, power is the capacity to affect the behaviour of others, and that's what we want from a leader, their ability to affect the behaviour of others in a way which helps to deliver the goals of the project. Another key question. Leadership is critical for effective project management. I think we've seen this. So we have seen that project manager needs power, but he or she needs to exercise this effectively. So, what makes a good leader? And this is where we turn to some theories. So we have trait theory, the great man. Traits are distinguishing personal characteristics such as intelligence, values, appearance, and so forth. Behavioural approaches. So the democratic style might be leaders delegate authority, encourage participation, and rely on expert and referent power. And contingency theory. Actually, this is probably the most influential and useful theory, I guess, in that the style of the leader, the style of the project manager varies depending on the particular situation they find themselves in, the nature of the project, the leader's formal power position, the structures of the task. What I found in my studying of projects is that project managers often start off as very kind of egalitarian leaders who maybe have a lot of referent power and rely on that referent power and maybe expert power to get people to work together. They're at the stage of them trying to get the project team to cohere and be cohesive to deliver. And then as the project goes on, especially if time starts to slip or costs start to increase and risks start to emerge, then they start to shift in their leadership style and become far more aggressive, far more authoritarian, rely on perhaps legitimate power, maybe coercive and reward power to get the project through to the end, speed up action and get people to work harder. Ancona came with this kind of neat model, I think, which is a project leadership model, which we can think about. For Ancona, there is four ways of thinking about leadership in projects. We have visioning, which is defining the project mission and what Ancona called future perfect thinking. We have sense making, understanding risk and uncertainty and making sense of those. Reflective practice, what's happening, what's working, what isn't working. Trial and error learning, and management by walking around. In other words, being involved in the project, not looking yourself away from the activities. Inventing, being thinking about new and innovative organisational designs which will get the project delivered. Dealing with problems and thinking about different ways of planning and delivering the project. And then relationship aspects, collaborating, teamwork, getting teams to work together and effectively, and trust, ensuring people trust each other and trust you as their leader. So there we are, we've got to the end of this session. And as I said, we've got two distinct sections. The first section was stakeholders and projects. So stakeholders are everywhere and are often people you wouldn't necessarily think of in the first instance, but through identification processes, you can identify them and then start to analyse and manage their involvement. There's an issue around stakeholder saliency, which stakeholders have power, which ones don't, who's important, who isn't important, who has formal connections to the project, who doesn't have formal connections. And I think often overlooked is the disruptive influence of stakeholders. Both supportive stakeholders and unsupportive stakeholders can be disruptive to project goals. So essentially, I regard stakeholders as a key risk, often overlooked risk, in project delivery. Then the other part of the session was about project managers as leaders, and here I talked about the activities and roles of the project manager, sort of things they're expected to do, thought about how they're selected a bit, try to unpick a bit about what's a manager and a leader and how these are distinctive. I think a project manager has to be both a manager and a leader, and about what makes a leader. It's about power, it's about exercising that power in order to get people within the project and around the project to act in the way you want them to act, to see, to ensure that the project goals and aims are delivered. Thank you.